Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you.
Turbulence and trepidation. The seatbelt dug into Sarah's lap, a familiar pressure that usually brought a sense of security. Today, it felt like a shackle. The rhythmic hum of the plane's engines vibrated through her bones, a stark contrast to the frantic beeping of monitors and the ragged gasps of patients she'd heard just days ago. The memory of the ER, the smell of antiseptic mingling with fear, clung to her like a phantom limb. She closed her eyes, willing herself to focus on the present, a cross-country flight to see her sister, a much-needed break, the cabin filled with the jostling energy of boarding passengers. A businessman barked into his phone, oblivious to the glares he received. A young couple giggled, fumbling with their carry-ons. Sarah watched them, a pang of envy twisting in her chest. She envied their carefree demeanor, their ability to move on without the lingering shadow of trauma. A tall woman with razor-sharp cheekbones and a severe black suit settled into the aisle seat across from her. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight bun, accentuating the icy precision of her features. She snapped open a laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Evelyn Reed," Sarah overheard the flight attendant say, offering a pre-flight beverage. Ms. Reed declined with a curt nod, her gaze never leaving the screen. Ambitious, Sarah surmised, the kind of woman who probably squeezed every last drop out of the day. Then came Dr. Thorne. He moved with an unsettling grace, his movements deliberate and almost too smooth. He was dressed in a tweed jacket and wore glasses perched low on his nose, giving him the air of an absent-minded professor, but there was something sharp in his eyes, a glint of intelligence that felt off. He stowed a worn leather briefcase in the overhead compartment, his fingers lingering a moment too long on the latch. When he turned, he offered Sarah a polite, almost theatrical smile. "Terribly sorry for the inconvenience," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant baritone. "Dread flying myself." Sarah managed a weak smile in return. His apology felt strangely insincere, and his eyes held a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. Resentment, maybe? Or something darker? She chided herself for being paranoid. It was just nerves, the lingering anxiety from the ER. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The plane taxied onto the runway, the engines roaring to life. Sarah gripped the armrests, her knuckles white. She tried to focus on her breathing, remembering the calming techniques she taught her patients. Inhale, exhale. This was just a flight. A routine trip. She would be fine. As the plane leveled off, the seatbelt light flicked off. People began to stir, reaching for their bags and settling in for the long haul. Dr. Thorne retrieved his briefcase. He opened it on his lap, shielding it from view with his body. Sarah caught a glimpse of what looked like medical instruments, scalpels, syringes, neatly arranged in a velvet-lined case. He selected a small vial, no bigger than her thumb, filled with a pearlescent liquid. His hands were steady, his movements precise. Then he pressed a hidden button on the side of the briefcase. A small panel slid open, revealing a concealed compartment. From it, he withdrew a small, intricate device, a nebulizer modified in some way she couldn't quite discern from this distance. He carefully loaded the vial into the device, his face a mask of intense concentration. He tested the nozzle, a fine mist spraying into the briefcase. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Her instincts screamed at her. Something was terribly wrong. This wasn't just a nervous traveler with a fear of flying. This was something else entirely, something dangerous. She glanced around the cabin, her eyes scanning the other passengers. Ms. Reed was still engrossed in her laptop, oblivious to the unfolding drama. The young couple was asleep, their heads resting on each other's shoulders. No one seemed to notice Dr. Thorne's furtive movements. He snapped the briefcase shut, the click echoing in the sudden silence of her own heightened awareness. He leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. His expression was serene, almost peaceful. Sarah knew she couldn't ignore what she had seen. Her training, her oath, demanded that she act, but what could she do? She was trapped on a plane, thousands of feet in the air, with a potential threat sitting just across the aisle. Fear warred with duty. The memory of the ER, the faces of those she couldn't save, flashed before her eyes. She couldn't let that happen again. Not if she could help it. She had to do something. Now, first sign. The thrum of the 777's engines cast a soporific spell on most of the passengers. Sarah, however, vibrated with a subtle unease, every nerve ending alight. She found herself repeatedly drawn to Dr. Thorne, now absorbed in a dense medical journal, a deep crease etching itself between his brows. A suppressed moan cut through the cabin's ambient drone. Snapping Sarah's attention forward. Point 2 rows ahead and across the aisle from Thorne, a man clutched at his midsection, his face ashen and glistening with a film of sweat. He shifted, his grip on the armrest tightening until his knuckles shone bone white. "Excuse me," he croaked, his voice strained and thin. "Is there a barf bag?" His wife, seated beside him, frantically pawed through the seat pocket. "Here, darling, here." She produced a paper bag and held it open. He lurched forward, retching weakly. Sarah's pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Though airsickness was a common airborne ailment, the man's sickly complexion hinted at something more sinister. She fought down the rising tide of panic. The ghosts of the ER, the shrill cries of coded pages and frantic interventions still haunted her. Unbuckling her seatbelt, she leaned forward. "Are you all right?" she inquired, striving to keep her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He waved her off, a gesture of weak dismissal. "Just a touch of airsickness. I'll be fine." He closed his eyes, tiny droplets of perspiration coalescing on his forehead. Sarah wavered. Her medical instincts screamed for action, demanding she assess the situation, render aid. Yet, the recent ordeal had left her doubting her abilities. Wary of her judgment, was she merely projecting her anxieties onto an innocent traveler, conjuring danger where none existed? Her gaze flickered to Dr. Thorne. He had lowered his journal and observed the unfolding drama. His expression inscrutable, there was no hint of concern, no flicker of empathy, only a detached, almost analytical curiosity. It sent a chill crawling down Sarah's spine. The woman beside the afflicted man dabbed at his brow with a tissue. "Perhaps we should alert a flight attendant," she suggested, anxiety edging her tone. No, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "It'll pass." Sarah lingered, her mind a whirlwind of possibilities. The cabin air felt heavy, pregnant with an unspoken dread. The man's shallow, raspy breathing filled the silence, rummaging in the overhead compartment. She unearthed her small travel kit and extracted a packet of antiseptic wipes. Returning to the man, she offered them to his wife. "Here, these might help him feel a bit better." The woman accepted the wipes with a grateful inclination of her head. "Thank you." Sarah retreated to her seat, her eyes glued to the tableau ahead. The man's condition showed no signs of improvement. He now sagged against the window, his breaths coming in short, rapid gasps. Again, she cast a furtive glance at Thorne. He remained motionless. His gaze fixed, his eyes were narrowed, his lips curved in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The subtle expression might have gone unnoticed by another, but Sarah saw it, and in that instant a chilling certainty seeped into her bones. This was not mere airsickness. This was something altogether different. She gripped the armrests, her knuckles stark against the fabric. The lingering trauma, the fatigue, the fear, all receded, replaced by a laser-like focus, whatever was unfolding. She could no longer ignore it. She couldn't afford to be wrong this time. The spreading sickness. The retching rippled through the cabin. Mr. Abernathy was no longer alone in his misery. Across the narrow aisle, a young woman clawed at her throat, her skin erupting in angry, red welts. Then, a child, no older than 7, began to cough, a ragged, grating sound that clawed at the relative quiet of the aircraft. Sarah's unease bloomed into stark terror. This wasn't mere turbulence or pre-flight jitters. This was a chain reaction. Ignoring the fine tremor in her fingers, she moved with purpose toward the stricken woman. "Are you all right? Can you draw breath?" The woman gasped, pointing, her eyes wide with panic. "Chest, tight, can't." Sarah quickly assessed her neck. Swollen. Anaphylaxis? But that didn't account for the hacking cough of the child or Mr. Abernathy's face, now an alarming shade of plum. She yanked down the woman's oxygen mask, securing it. Deep breaths. Slow, deep breaths. From the corner of her eye, she registered Marcus approaching, his brow creased with worry. "What's going on? Something in the ventilation?" "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice strained. "But it's spreading, too quickly." She gestured towards the child, now struggling for air. His mother, near frantic, patted his back, tears silently tracing paths down her cheeks. Marcus knelt beside them. "Hey buddy, what's wrong, little man?" He touched the boy's forehead. "He's burning up with fever." The boy's breath came in short, whistling gasps, his face flushed scarlet. "It hurts. My chest hurts bad." A cold knot tightened in Sarah's stomach. Respiratory distress, skin lesions, fever, a baffling combination of symptoms. She shot a quick glance at Dr. Thorne, but he remained a statue in his seat, the unsettling smile banished, replaced by an inscrutable mask. "Marcus, he needs oxygen too," Sarah said, urgency sharpening her tone. "And we need to alert the flight crew. This is beyond airsickness." Marcus's usual easygoing demeanor vanished, replaced by focused action. "I'll find the flight attendants." He pushed his way toward the front, navigating the increasingly agitated passengers. Sarah grabbed one of the air sickness bags, offering it to the boy's mother. Have him breathe into this. It may help him slow his breathing pattern. Further down the aisle, another round of coughing erupted. Near the emergency exit, a man clutched at his own throat, his features contorted with dread. A rash, mirroring the young woman's, bloomed across his skin. Adrenaline surged through Sarah's veins. This was escalating exponentially. No accident. A pattern. A terrifying, unexplainable pattern. She pressed forward, sidestepping anxious onlookers toward the afflicted man. Sir, can you hear me? Tell me what you're feeling. He could only rasp, incapable of coherent speech, his hand a claw at his throat. His eyes bulged, reflecting raw fright. Sarah found a rapid, thready pulse. He needed oxygen, now, but the overheads were inaccessible, blocked by bags. Excuse me, she called out, raising her voice to cut through the rising panic. Is there a doctor on board? A nurse, perhaps? Silence. Fear had rendered them immobile, deaf to her plea. Marcus returned, 2 flight attendants trailing behind, their faces ashen. The captain's been notified. He's trying to arrange an emergency landing, but... He paused, indicating the burgeoning chaos. We don't have time to wait for that, Sarah stated, her voice firm and clear. We need to triage, get all available oxygen to those who need it most, and we need a working space. The flight attendants, initially stunned into inaction, seemed to find their bearings beneath the weight of Sarah's authority. They began to direct passengers back to their seats, attempting to impose some semblance of order. Sarah knelt beside the struggling man. Battling for breath, this wasn't a random event. Something was triggering this, something purposeful. The thought sent a jolt of ice through her. She looked again at Dr. Thorne, still watching, still silent. This wasn't just an in-flight medical crisis, she understood with dawning horror. This was something far more sinister, and time, she realized, had almost run out. Emergency protocol. Marcus, no time for second-guessing, Sarah snapped, tugging him down the narrow passage. A sharp, metallic scent, tinged with an unidentifiable bitterness, permeated the air. Observe. The eruptions, the fever pitch, the gasping for air, it's escalating rapidly. This transcends a simple bug. Doubt etched across Marcus's face began to fade as he registered the alarm in her tone, the palpable tension radiating from her. A glib remark hovered on his tongue, then vanished unuttered. All right, I get it, but what is it exactly? I can't say, but it's unnatural and it's moving like wildfire. She indicated a businessman slumped nearby, his complexion flushed and mottled, struggling to draw breath. We have to get to the cockpit, now. They squeezed through a growing cluster of nervous passengers by the galley, the atmosphere thick with anxious muttering and suppressed coughs. Sarah's pulse quickened. Faces blurred into a mosaic of apprehension and bewilderment. An unsettling familiarity prickled at her senses, echoing a buried trauma. She quelled the memory, focusing on the present danger, the lives at risk. Marcus cleared his throat, addressing the flight attendant guarding the cockpit door. Excuse me, we require immediate access to the captain. It's critical. The attendant, her eyes showing fatigue, hesitated. The captain's preparing for potential turbulence. I'm not certain. This supersedes turbulence, Sarah pressed, her voice laced with urgency. Lives depend on it. Without waiting for assent, she reached past the attendant and rapped sharply on the reinforced barrier. Moments later, the door yielded and a towering figure with a flinty gaze emerged. What's the trouble? Captain Reynolds' voice was terse, authoritative. Marcus explained quickly, Captain, this is Sarah Chin, a registered nurse. She believes a severe medical crisis is unfolding on board. Several passengers are displaying consistent symptoms. Sarah interjected, it's progressing at an alarming rate, Captain. The symptoms suggest exposure to a highly virulent agent. I can't identify it, but we must entertain the notion of foul play. Reynolds' expression turned hard. Foul play? Are you suggesting sabotage? I'm suggesting we consider all possibilities, Sarah countered, locking eyes with him. The abrupt onset, the severity, it's unprecedented. We need to isolate those affected, notify ground control, and prepare for an emergency descent. The captain scrutinized her, his gaze unwavering. He detected not panic, but a laser focus, a controlled agitation. He perceived a professional confronting a crisis. He inhaled deeply. Understood. I'll contact ground control at once. I need a comprehensive assessment from you, Miss Chin. Tell me what we're facing. He gestured towards Marcus. You, remain with Miss Chin, provide whatever assistance she needs. He disappeared back into the cockpit, the door sealing shut with a definitive thud. Inside, Reynolds activated the intercom. This is your captain speaking. We are encountering an unforeseen medical emergency on board. We are diverting to the nearest airport for an immediate landing. Please remain composed and adhere to the crew's instructions. Further details will be provided shortly. A wave of hushed inquiries spread through the cabin, followed by a palpable surge of fear. Sarah felt the immense burden of responsibility descend upon her. She turned to Marcus, her voice barely audible. "We're on the clock. Can you assist?" Marcus, his skepticism replaced by steely resolve, nodded. "Just say the word. We need to improvise barriers, anything we can find. Blankets, pillows, headrest covers. We have to establish a quarantine perimeter." Sarah surveyed the cabin, her mind already strategizing, sketching out a plan. "And we need to identify the source. Who fell ill first?" The task seemed insurmountable, the odds heavily against them, but as Sarah pressed forward, confronting the rising tide of terror, she held fast to one conviction: she wouldn't let another life be lost, not on her watch. Galley ICU. "All right, listen up," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We need to turn this galley into a triage area, fast." Marcus, ever the pragmatist, raised an eyebrow. "A triage area in a galley designed for warming pretzels?" "It's all we've got," Sarah retorted, her gaze sweeping over the cramped space. Stainless steel gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Rows of liquor bottles and snack containers lined the shelves. The smell of reheated coffee hung in the air, a stark contrast to the growing sense of dread. "We need to be organized. Marcus, you're with me. We need to clear this space." She pointed to a stack of folded blankets and pillows. "Those can be used for support. Extra seat cushions too. Get them from the overhead bins." To another flight attendant, a young woman with wide, frightened eyes, she said, "Find any spare blankets or pillows, anything soft. We need to make the infected comfortable." The cabin crew, initially stunned, now moved with a purpose born of necessity. They hustled, grabbing blankets and pillows, clearing the countertops of trays and utensils. Marcus, true to his word, was a whirlwind of efficiency. He wrestled a beverage cart into the center of the galley. "Think of it as a mobile gurney," he quipped, wiping sweat from his brow. "Slightly less glamorous, but gets the job done." Sarah nodded, appreciating his attempt at levity. "Seatbelts. We need seatbelts. As restraints. In case anyone becomes agitated." Marcus's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "Right, restraints. Good call." He started ripping seatbelts from the unoccupied seats, the sharp tearing sound echoing in the tense atmosphere. "Oxygen masks," Sarah continued, rummaging through the emergency medical kit. "We'll need them for anyone having difficulty breathing, and anything else we can find that might be useful." The galley transformed. The beverage cart, draped with a blanket, became a makeshift bed. Seatbelts lay ready, coiled like snakes. Oxygen masks, with their sterile scent, were stacked on the countertop. The space, once a symbol of in-flight comfort, now radiated a stark, clinical urgency. As Sarah organized the supplies, she noticed Evelyn Reed, the businesswoman from earlier, standing at the edge of the aisle, watching the scene unfold with growing anxiety. Her eyes darted between the frantic activity and the pale, coughing passengers being assisted to the back of the plane. She clutched her briefcase tightly to her chest, her knuckles white. Evelyn cleared her throat, her voice tight. "What's happening? Is everyone going to be all right?" Sarah met her gaze, her expression serious. "We're doing everything we can." She couldn't offer empty assurances, not now. The metallic tang of fear, mingling with the antiseptic smell of the alcohol wipes, filled the galley. The hum of the plane engines seemed to grow louder, a constant, relentless reminder of their isolation, suspended thousands of feet above the earth. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself. This was it, the real test, and she had no choice but to be ready. Race against time. Sweat beaded on Sarah's forehead, plastering strands of hair to her temples. The recycled air, thick with fear and the metallic tang of disinfectant, felt suffocating. She moved from patient to patient, her fingers flying, checking pupils, feeling for pulses that were becoming frighteningly thready. Evelyn, pale and wide-eyed, hovered nearby, a silent, trembling question mark. Sarah offered a strained smile. "Just monitoring," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the anxious murmurs. Mr. Henderson, the businessman with the briefcase, was fading fast. His skin, previously flushed, was now clammy and mottled. His breathing, once ragged, was shallow and erratic. She checked his oxygen saturation, plummeting. "Damn it. Marcus, can you find anything to suction? We need to clear his airway." Her voice was sharp, laced with urgency. While Marcus rummaged, Sarah pulled down Henderson's lower eyelid. The conjunctivae were bright red, almost hemorrhagic, not viral, not bacterial, something toxic and fast-acting. She needed information, and fast. The Wi-Fi, she barked, pivoting towards a flight attendant wrestling with a blood pressure cuff. Get me access. I need to look up something. The connection crawled, each loading bar an agonizing delay. Web pages buffered, then timed out. Sarah swore under her breath, her fingers drumming impatiently on the small screen. Every second wasted was a second closer to disaster. She tried a different approach, searching for symptom clusters: rapid onset, respiratory distress, conjunctival hemorrhage. Nothing conclusive. Frustration gnawed at her. Without a proper lab, without a toxicology screen, she was flying blind. Her clinical experience was her only weapon now. She racked her brain, pulling up forgotten lectures, obscure case studies. Had she seen something like this before? A dim recollection flickered. A briefing on biological warfare agents years ago during a training exercise. The thought sent a chill down her spine. Henderson's breathing hitched, then stopped altogether. No. Sarah ripped open an oxygen mask, forcing it over his face. She pinched his nostrils shut and began to breathe for him, her own lungs burning with the effort. Marcus, his face etched with worry, stood frozen, a makeshift suction device. A bulb syringe meant for infants, clutched in his hand. Help me get him on the floor, she gasped, her voice strained. We need to start chest compressions. Evelyn recoiled, whimpering. The small space felt even smaller, the air thicker with despair. The galley was a chaotic ballet of desperation. Oxygen masks, hastily torn first aid kits, and the frantic movements of the crew painted a grim tableau. As she knelt beside Henderson, her hands pumping rhythmically on his chest, Sarah felt a surge of helpless rage. She was a nurse, trained to heal, to comfort, but here, thousands of feet in the air, she was fighting a ghost, an invisible enemy she couldn't even name. She glanced at the other patients. A young girl was coughing violently, her face flushed. An elderly man was slumped in his seat, his eyes glazed over. Time was collapsing, each breath a precious commodity. Henderson remained unresponsive. She could feel the ribs creaking beneath her hands, but there was no flicker of life. The monitor flatlined. With a heavy heart, Sarah stopped. Time of death, she announced, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was a formality, a clinical observation in the face of utter devastation. She looked at Marcus, his face a mask of shock. We need to focus on the others. We don't have time to grieve. She knew, with a cold certainty, that Henderson wouldn't be the last. This wasn't just an emergency, it was a countdown. A race against an invisible clock, ticking down to an unknown, but undoubtedly catastrophic, finale, and she, armed with only her wits and her training, was all that stood between them and the abyss, the source. The acrid taste of bile clung to Sarah's palate, a lingering reminder of Henderson's final, agonizing moments. She wrestled her focus back, banishing the memory of his twisted features. Panic was contagious. A creeping dread she couldn't allow to overwhelm the others. The oxygen masks exhaled their steady, mechanical sighs, a monotonous backdrop to the strained wheezes and shallow gasps filling the cabin. Shedding her gloves, Sarah found her palms slick with a cold sweat despite the frigid air. She craved understanding, a pattern to cut through the escalating pandemonium. Marcus, she rasped, her voice strained. Get me that seating manifest. Stat. Marcus, concern creasing his face but his movements crisp and precise, was back in moments with the printout. Sarah flattened it on the small, blood-smeared table in the galley. Overhead, the fluorescent lights buzzed, bathing the seat grid in a clinical luminescence. She began marking the chart, an X blossoming beside each passenger displaying symptoms. Scarlet for severe, amber for moderate, gold for mild. At first, the distribution appeared haphazard, a random smattering of affliction throughout the fuselage, but as the minutes ticked by, a disquieting pattern began to coalesce. The densest concentration of scarlet X's centered amidships. In sections D and E. Closer inspection revealed a clear ground zero. The symptoms diminished with distance, radiating outward from seats in that particular zone. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her fingertip traced the unseen vectors of sickness across the grid. Ground zero. Focused on row 14. She consulted the manifest. Row 14, seats D, E, and F. Dr. Eris Thorne. A colder shiver than the cabin air snaked down her spine. Coincidence? Perhaps, but after witnessing what she had, she could dismiss nothing. Marcus, she murmured, her voice tight with burgeoning alarm. Look at this. She indicated the crimson cluster around Dr. Thorne's seat. The worst cases are all here. This isn't random chance. Marcus scrutinized the chart, brow furrowed in thought. His gaze flickered towards Dr. Thorne, apparently undisturbed. Engrossed in a book beneath the wan beam of his personal reading lamp. No requests for water. No complaints voice. No hint of concern regarding the burgeoning medical crisis. You think he's the source? Marcus whispered, barely audible. I can't say for sure, Sarah conceded, but we need to watch him, subtly, see if anything seems amiss. Marcus nodded, his features hardening with resolve. He moved into the cabin, adopting a nonchalant stride, as if casually checking on passengers. He sauntered past Dr. Thorne's row, feigning interest in the overhead storage. Sarah observed from the galley, her pulse throbbing in her ears. Returning moments later, Marcus's eyes were narrowed. He's unnervingly composed, he reported. Everyone else is losing it, coughing, gasping, terrified. He's just turning pages, and I think I saw him adjust something in his pocket. A small vial, maybe, difficult to be certain from that angle. A vial, the coincidence was mounting. Okay, Sarah stated, her voice gaining steel, her earlier hesitation dissolving. We need to isolate him, but we need solid evidence first, something irrefutable. She seized a fresh pair of gloves and a small, sterile container. I'm going to collect another sample from one of the severely affected passengers close to him, she explained. If it corresponds with what we found in Henderson and if it differs from the control, we'll have our justification. The walk to row 12 felt interminable. Each hacking cough, each strangled gasp was a leaden weight on her spirit. She reached Mrs. Davies, the woman's face now marred by a livid rash. Ma'am, I need another sample just to track your progress, Sarah said, her tone soothing. Mrs. Davies offered a feeble nod, her eyes pools of terror. Sarah swiftly swabbed the back of her throat, careful not to exacerbate her distress. As she turned away, she chanced a glance at Dr. Thorne. He was still absorbed in his reading, but Sarah detected a fleeting flicker in his gaze, a momentary, almost imperceptible pursing of his lips. He was aware. Safely back in the galley, Sarah carefully sealed the sample. The time for observation had passed. Now was the moment for action. The cabin air felt thick, pregnant with a silent, invisible menace. She met Marcus's gaze, her own reflecting grim determination. It's him, she affirmed. I'm sure of it. Thorne's vendetta. The ghost of Thorne's past, a pristine lab with its whirring machinery and the naive optimism he once embraced, now taunted him. He had been Dr. Aris Thorne, GenCorp Pharmaceuticals' celebrated prodigy, his name a byword for innovation. Poised to revolutionize medicine, but that vision evaporated into the stark reality of the boardroom's fluorescent lights. The air, heavy with the scent of ambition and unspoken avarice, felt suffocating. The executive board, masked in detached professionalism, sat across the gleaming mahogany. The trials offer ambiguous results. Mr. Caldwell, the CEO, had announced, his voice smooth as well-worn leather. An unacceptable rate of severe side effects. We cannot authorize further investment. Thorne had bristled, his voice a tightrope walk between control and outrage. But the scope, the potential benefit. We're talking about eradicating a scourge that has plagued humanity for generations. These minor setbacks are statistically insignificant in the grand scheme. Insignificant to you, perhaps. A woman with eyes like glacial ice had countered. Not to our legal counsel. Or to our investors. We operate as a business. Doctor, not as a philanthropic institution. He recalled the wave of nausea, the avalanche of disappointment. Years poured into research. A life dedicated to discovery, brushed aside for quarterly projections. He had glimpsed the charts, the calculations, the emotionless figures that placed profit over people. He had protested, debated, implored, only to be met with impassive gazes and hollow assurances. We appreciate your dedication, Dr. Thorne. Caldwell had continued, his smile as sharp as broken glass. However, we've concluded the necessity to streamline operations within the department. Your position is no longer required. The word echoed, a death sentence to his aspirations. Redundant, he had been shelved, deemed expendable, his work labeled as worthless. Now, years later, strapped into his seat on Flight 374, that same nausea churned within him, but seasoned with a bitter anticipation. The engine's drone was a lullaby to his coming retribution. His gaze drifted down to the innocent vial nestled in his pocket, crystalline, almost ethereal. It held the distilled essence of his research, refined and enhanced. He had reclaimed what they had discarded as unnecessary and molded it into a weapon. The memory of Evelyn Reed, the woman with the frigid gaze who had so clinically dismissed him, stoked the inferno within. She had been pivotal in his downfall, the most vocal opponent of his project. She had sealed his fate. A recent press release heralded her ascent to chief operating officer. She was on board this aircraft. In first class, seat 28, he had toiled for months in his isolated lab, a converted barn far from the city's sprawl, isolating and amplifying the pathogen's potency. He had studied their mistakes, eradicating the statistically insignificant complications. He had made it poetic, highly contagious, severely debilitating, and ultimately, a reflection of their crimes, a punishment tailored to their insatiable greed, their heartless indifference. He had meticulously calibrated the dispersal mechanism, a concealed nebulizer disguised as an asthma inhaler. He had selected a congested flight, contained environment to maximize dissemination. He didn't seek indiscriminate slaughter, merely a focused lesson, a reminder that certain debts demanded repayment, that some injustices needed correction. His eyes scanned the cabin, momentarily resting on the countenances of the afflicted. That a brief pang of something that resembled remorse flickered, only to be extinguished. Acceptable losses, necessary sacrifices. He locked onto the ultimate goal, the image of Evelyn Reed, her face gripped by terror, her helplessness the perfect retribution for her cruelty. He had delivered a message. His research had not been in vain confrontation. Thorne was in the galley, nursing a ginger ale with unnerving composure. The overhead lights reflected off his spectacles, underscoring the unsettling calm etched onto his face. He might have been awaiting a social call, not a burgeoning medical crisis. Dr. Thorne, Sarah began, her voice strained, a moment of your time. He lowered the can with agonizing deliberation. Nurse Chun. Of course. Regarding our present predicament, I gather. A practiced smile, cold as glacial ice, surfaced. Predicament falls short. The swift escalation of identical symptoms in multiple individuals suggests something far beyond a natural outbreak. She met his gaze, seeking any betraying flicker of guilt or dread. As a physician, I am not oblivious to that, Thorne replied smoothly. A shared meal, perhaps? A case of virulent food poisoning. Food poisoning doesn't trigger acute respiratory distress and internal hemorrhaging. Sarah folded her arms, her suspicion solidifying. That toxin, its sophistication is remarkable. Almost bespoke. Your past at GenCorp, Dr. Biological Research, wasn't it? The smile evaporated, replaced by a subtle tightening at the corners of his eyes. My tenure at GenCorp is hardly classified. I consulted on diverse projects. Certainly, theoretical work, all of it. Never involving weaponization. Theoretical studies shelved for being too perilous, too unprofitable. Sarah shot back, the word laced with scorn. Evelyn Reed pulled the plug, didn't she? And she's aboard this flight. Thorne gave a dry, mirthless chuckle. Nurse Chun, you're succumbing to fantasy. You believe I intentionally unleashed this contagion? Absurd and personally offensive. He adjusted his tie, a calculated act of regaining composure. I'm a doctor. My oath is to preserve life. Oaths are brittle things, Sarah countered, her voice a low thrum, especially when fueled by ambition and resentment. She closed the space between them, invading his sphere. What was in that vial, Thorne? What did you unleash into the air? He inclined his head, studying her with chilling thoroughness. You seem unusually invested in this hypothesis, Nurse Chun. Are you certain your judgment isn't clouded? Perhaps the tension is becoming overwhelming. A pointed pause hung in the air. I observed your earlier discomposure. Recovering from something, were you? Sarah recoiled, the jab striking home. He knew. He was aware of her shaky equilibrium, her recent struggle for control. He was weaponizing it. Spare me the armchair analysis, doctor. Just give me the truth. The truth is, I share your concern about this calamity. Perhaps even more acutely, given my training. He gestured towards the burgeoning chaos in the cabin. Instead of indulging in unfounded accusations, your energy would be better spent assisting the afflicted. Time is dwindling, is it not? He was right, damn him. Lives were hanging in the balance. Yet she couldn't quell the feeling he was deliberately misdirecting her. subtly sabotaging her efforts. Then assist me, Sarah pleaded, a hard edge returning to her tone. Tell me what we face. Equip me with the knowledge to save these people. Thorne feigned deep thought. Very well, my assessment points towards a highly transmissible viral agent. The abbreviated incubation window drastically complicates matters. Common antiviral treatments may prove futile. Prioritize respiratory support and aggressive fever management. He paused, his eyes glinting behind the lenses. Exercise extreme caution with fluid resuscitation. Overloading could exacerbate the pulmonary complications. Sarah scowled. There was something in his intonation, the strategic inflection, that felt artificial. Was he being genuinely helpful, or subtly steering her toward a counterproductive approach? Thank you, doctor, she said, adopting a carefully measured tone. I'll consider your input. Trust was a currency she couldn't afford to spend. She needed independent verification of every syllable he uttered, every data point he offered. Naturally, Nurse Chan, Thorne said, the smile making a reappearance. Anything I can contribute. After all, we're navigating this together. The phrase hung in the air, a threat thinly veiled as camaraderie. Sarah knew this was merely the opening gambit. The game had begun. Exposed. Sarah fought the urge to scrub her hands raw. Thorne's proximity felt like contamination. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. Abandoning the patient she had been tending to, she slipped into the cramped galley, the metallic tang of stale coffee clinging to the air. She found a relatively clean corner and pulled out her phone, praying for a decent signal. Miraculously, a single bar flickered to life. Her fingers flew across the screen, navigating to a search engine. Eris Thorne, GenCorp, she typed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The results flooded in. A mix of academic papers, news articles, and scathing op-eds. She scanned them, her eyes darting across headlines like GenCorp scientist fired after ethical concerns, and Thorne's research, breakthrough or bioweapon. She clicked on a scientific journal article, novel peptide delivery system for targeted cellular disruption. Thorne was the lead author. Skimming the abstract, she felt a chill crawl down her spine. The article detailed a method for delivering highly specific toxins to targeted cell types, bypassing traditional immune responses. The delivery mechanism? A modified airborne peptide. Her mind raced. The symptoms, the rapid onset, the way the illness seemed to be selectively attacking certain individuals, it all clicked into place. This wasn't some random pathogen. It was a meticulously engineered weapon. Taking a deep breath, she printed the search results to a PDF. Knowing she would need this evidence later with newfound resolve, she strode back into the chaotic cabin, her gaze fixed on Thorne, who was now calmly adjusting the oxygen mask on an elderly woman. Dr. Thorne? She said, her voice low but firm, cutting through the murmurs of distress. That peptide delivery system you developed at GenCorp. The one that targets specific cell types while evading immune detection. Thorne's head snapped up, his eyes widening behind his glasses. The placid mask he'd been wearing cracked, revealing a flicker of something. Something dark and calculating. He opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah pressed on, relentless. The modified peptide, she continued, her voice gaining strength. It's designed to bind to a specific receptor, isn't it? A receptor prevalent in individuals with a particular genetic predisposition or perhaps those with a specific medical history. He stared at her, his silence a deafening admission. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. Who is it, Thorne? Sarah demanded, her voice sharp. Who's the target? He remained silent, his lips pressed into a thin line. Sarah stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. Think, doctor, she said, her voice laced with steel. You spent years of your life dedicated to this research. GenCorp took it from you, discredited you. Who profited from your downfall? She paused, letting her words sink in. She saw the recognition dawn in his eyes, followed by a wave of barely suppressed fury. Evelyn Reed, Sarah stated, the name hanging in the air like a poison dart. C2A. Former GenCorp executive, now COO. She was instrumental in shutting down your research, wasn't she? In destroying your career? Thorne's composure finally shattered, his hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. That viper, he hissed, his voice barely audible above the groans of the sick. Sarah didn't miss the confirmation. She knew now. Evelyn Reed was the target, and Eris Thorne, driven by years of simmering resentment, had just exposed himself. The game had changed. It was no longer just about containing a disease, it was about stopping a deliberate act of revenge. Desperate measures. The tremor in Thorne's hands intensified as he fumbled within his carry-on. Sarah lunged, adrenaline surging, the sterile scent of the antiseptic wipes now mocking in its inadequacy. "Don't," she yelled. But the word was swallowed by the cabin's rising panic. He pulled out a sleek, metallic cylinder no bigger than a thermos. A soft, almost inaudible hiss escaped from its tip. This wasn't a cure, it was more of the poison. "You won't stop me," Thorne hissed, his voice a venomous rasp. "They deserve this, all of them." He twisted a dial on the cylinder. The hiss intensified, becoming a high-pitched whine that cut through the ambient noise of the plane. Sarah had to act. Now. She threw herself forward, aiming for the cylinder, but Thorne anticipated her move. He sidestepped. A surprising agility for a man his age, and swung the cylinder in a wide arc. The cold metal connected with her temple, sending a jolt of pain through her skull. Stars danced behind her eyes. "Stay back," Thorne warned, his gaze manic. "This will all be over soon." He took another step towards the center aisle, intent on dispersing the toxin further. Ignoring the throbbing in her head, Sarah scrambled to her feet. She grabbed a discarded blanket from a nearby seat, anything to slow him down. She hurled it at Thorne. The lightweight fabric momentarily blinding him. It was enough. She tackled him, her shoulder slamming into his chest. He stumbled backward, the cylinder slipping from his grasp and clattering onto the floor. The whine became a piercing shriek. Passengers screamed, their fear escalating to a fever pitch. Marcus, who had been watching the unfolding drama with a grim expression, finally moved. He surged forward, his movements surprisingly quick and decisive. "Give it up, Thorne," Marcus said. His voice low and dangerous. Thorne, pinned beneath Sarah, thrashed wildly. "Get off me, you don't understand. She ruined me." Marcus didn't hesitate. He grabbed Thorne's wrist, twisting it sharply. Thorne howled in pain, his struggles weakening. Other passengers, galvanized by Marcus's actions, joined in. A burly businessman helped to restrain Thorne's legs, while a flight attendant, her face pale but determined, retrieved the cylinder with a pair of tongs she'd grabbed from the galley. "Secure him with the restraints," Sarah gasped, pointing to a set of unused seatbelt extenders. "And someone get that cylinder away from here." The flight attendant nodded, passing the tongs to another crew member who carefully carried the device towards the rear of the plane, away from the passengers. Marcus and the businessman efficiently secured Thorne's hands and feet with the extenders. Thorne, now subdued, continued to rant, his voice a broken record of grievances and accusations against Evelyn Reed. The initial adrenaline rush faded, leaving Sarah shaky and nauseous. She leaned against a seat, her hand pressed to her throbbing temple. Marcus knelt beside her. "You okay, Sarah?" She nodded, trying to catch her breath. "Just processing." She looked at the restrained figure of Dr. Thorne, his face contorted with rage and regret. "He really meant to kill all of them, didn't he?" "Looks that way," Marcus said grimly. "Good thing you were here." He offered her a small, wry smile. "Never thought I'd be taking down a bioterrorist on a Tuesday afternoon." Sarah managed a weak smile in return. The immediate threat was contained, but the situation was far from over. They were still thousands of feet in the air, with a plane full of sick and frightened passengers. The real work had just begun. And she was the only one who could do it. Improvised antidote. Sarah's skull hammered with a persistent ache. An unwelcome rhythm against the drone of the engines. Thorne, meanwhile, remained a captive audience, courtesy of several passengers and an arsenal of seatbelts. The menace hadn't disappeared with his restraint, only mutated. The virus, or whatever insidious creation he'd unleashed, continued its silent rampage. Ignoring the jolt of pain knifing through her ribs, she hauled herself upright. "Marcus?" she rasped, her voice rough with exhaustion. "I need your help back there." Marcus, positioned as sentinel near Thorne, his features a rigid tableau of contained rage, pivoted. "At your service. The galley. I need a complete inventory. Food, beverages, anything that might give us a fighting chance at synthesizing. Something to slow this down." His brow arched skeptically. "Slow it down? You're planning to concoct an antidote from airline snacks." "Hardly ideal," Sarah conceded. "But it's all we've got. I need to see what's available, and I need to see it now." To his credit, Marcus didn't belabor the point. He signaled a flight attendant. a young woman whose wide eyes mirrored the collective dread within the cabin. Show her the galley, everything. Assist her in any way you can. The galley was a confined maze of stainless steel, ovens, fridges, and stacked containers. The flight attendant, Emily, her name tag a stark white against her pale uniform, fluttered around Sarah as she began her reconnaissance. Sarah tuned out her own discomfort and laser-focused on the task. What juices are available? Any fresh fruit on board? And what about medications, even the over-the-counter options? Emily recited a litany. Orange, apple, cranberry. A few apples and bananas. We have aspirin, some anti-nausea tablets. Sarah's gaze swept the shelves, her thoughts a frantic whirlwind. The key, she reasoned, was identifying something that could blunt the toxin's assault, fortify the immune system, perhaps even latch onto the invader itself. Vitamin C, antioxidants. She snagged the orange juice, a bottle of water, and the apples Emily offered. Do you have any baking soda, by any chance? She queried. Emily looked bewildered. Baking soda? I don't believe so. Maybe in the crew kitchen, but that's locked. Damn. Bicarbonate would have been perfect for neutralizing any acidic components of the toxin. She'd need to improvise. She tore into an apple, inhaling its faint, almost artificial fragrance that wasn't much. But it was all she had. She pulped the apple with the back of a spoon, diluting it with a splash of water to form a thin slurry. Marcus, she called. Find me some of the small coffee cups. He returned moments later, his expression still etched with worry. How can I contribute? We need to administer this. It's not a cure-all, but it's a first step. The vitamin C in the juice, the pectin in the apple, they might help stabilize them. She began portioning the mixture into the tiny cups, her hands betraying a slight tremor. It was a gamble. She knew, but inaction wasn't an option. I'm with you, Marcus stated, his voice a solid anchor. Just tell me what to do. Together, they moved through the beleaguered cabin, offering the thin gruel to the afflicted. Some were too far gone to accept anything. Their bodies consumed by violent spasms. Others managed a weak swallow. Their eyes reflecting a flicker of renewed hope. Sarah knelt beside a young girl, her face burning and her breath shallow and ragged. She gently guided a spoonful of the mixture between her parched lips. The girl swallowed feebly, her eyelids heavy and fluttering, time distorted. Each tick of the clock an unbearable weight. Sarah watched, pulse hammering, for any positive indication. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the girl's respiration eased. The feverish color began to recede from her cheeks. A wave of collective relief washed through the cabin as other patients displayed similar improvements. It wasn't a panacea. Not by any stretch. But it had bought them precious time. Marcus clapped Sarah on the back, a rare, genuine smile breaking through his grim facade. You did it, he said, amazed. You actually did it. Sarah managed a faint, exhausted smile. We bought time, she corrected. Now we have to identify this thing, understand it, and find a real solution. Landing. The jarring screech of tires against tarmac vibrated through Sarah's bones. A collective sigh, a ragged, uneven breath of relief, filled the cabin. They were down. The emergency landing had been rough, the pilot wrestling the Boeing 777 onto the designated runway at a small airport outside Boise, Idaho. But they were alive. Sarah leaned back, her muscles screaming in protest, every ache a reminder of the last few hours. The air, thick with the metallic tang of fear and antiseptic, suddenly felt breathable. We did it, Marcus murmured, his voice hoarse. He sat beside her, his usually immaculate suit rumpled and stained, his tie askew. A small, weary smile played on his lips. We actually did it. Outside, sirens wailed, growing louder, closer. Emergency vehicles, a kaleidoscope of flashing lights, swarmed the plane. Stay here, Sarah said. Pushing herself up, her head swam momentarily, and she gripped the seat for support. Let the professionals handle it now. The aircraft doors hissed open, flooding the cabin with cool night air and the organized chaos of first responders, medical personnel in hazmat suits. Their faces obscured by masks and shields, rushed inside, triaging passengers with practiced efficiency. Stretchers appeared, and the more critical patients were carefully transferred onto them. Whisked away into waiting ambulances, Dr. Thorne sat passively in his seat. His expression unreadable. Two armed officers, their movements swift and decisive, approached him. "Dr. Eris Thorne?" one of them asked, his voice muffled by the mask. "We need you to come with us." Thorne didn't resist. He stood, allowing himself to be handcuffed, his eyes betraying nothing as they led him away. Sarah caught his gaze. It wasn't defiance she saw, nor fear, but something far more chilling: emptiness. The evacuation proceeded swiftly. The flight attendants, their faces etched with exhaustion but their movements still precise, assisted the medical teams. Sarah watched as they carefully guided passengers, reassuring them with calm voices and gentle touches. The woman in a crisp white coat approached Sarah and Marcus. "I'm Dr. Emily Carter. Are you both all right?" "We're mostly okay," Sarah replied, gesturing to her bandaged arm. "We were able to stabilize some of the patients with a makeshift remedy." Dr. Carter raised an eyebrow. "Makeshift?" Marcus chuckled. "Let's just say airline snacks can be surprisingly versatile." Dr. Carter smiled, a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Well, whatever you did, it bought us valuable time. Thank you." As Sarah waited her turn to disembark, a news reporter, microphone in hand, approached her. "Excuse me, ma'am? Are you the nurse who coordinated the response on board?" Sarah recoiled slightly. The last thing she wanted was attention. "I just did what anyone would have done." "But you saved lives," the reporter insisted, pushing the microphone closer. "Passengers are calling you a hero." "No," Sarah said firmly, shaking her head. "The flight attendants, the passengers who helped. It was a team effort. We all worked together." She gestured toward the flight attendants, who were assisting a family with young children. They were incredible. They kept everyone calm, followed instructions, and put their own safety at risk. They are the real heroes. The reporter persisted, but Sarah politely declined to comment further. She had no desire for accolades, no need for recognition. Her reward was seeing the passengers, one by one, being safely taken off the plane. Finally, it was her turn as she stepped onto the ramp. The cool night air filled her lungs, cleansing and invigorating. The flashing lights of the emergency vehicles painted the scene in stark relief, a surreal tableau of rescue and recovery. That a paramedic approached her, offering a blanket. "You did good in there," he said, his voice kind. Sarah wrapped the blanket around herself, shivering slightly. "Thank you." Marcus joined her, his hand briefly touching her arm. "Ready for a strong cup of coffee?" Sarah managed a weak smile. "More than ready." As they walked toward the terminal, leaving the chaotic scene behind, Sarah glanced back at the plane. It stood silhouetted against the night sky, a silent testament to the crisis they had faced, the lives they had touched. The memory of the faces, the fear, the desperation, would stay with her. But so would the memory of the courage, the resilience, the unwavering spirit of humanity that had emerged in the face of unimaginable adversity. She knew that the scars of her past might never fully fade, but tonight, she had faced her fears and found a strength she didn't know she possessed. And that, she realized, was a victory in itself.